The elderly woman had already shown her boarding pass 3 times. 3 times she lifted the small white paper with trembling fingers and quietly pointed to the same number printed beside her name. Seat 2A. First class. Window seat. 3 times she tried to keep her voice calm, even as 40 strangers watched her standing in the aisle like she was asking for permission to exist somewhere she had already paid to be. But the man in the gray suit still refused to move. He leaned back against the leather seat with one ankle resting over his knee, staring at his phone like the woman beside him was nothing more than a delay in his schedule. And the longer he ignored her, the quieter the cabin became. Because everyone on that plane understood exactly what was happening. They just hadn't decided yet whether they were willing to admit it out loud. The woman's name was Dorothy Brooks, 72 years old, retired school cafeteria worker from Baltimore, widow, grandmother of 4. She was wearing a navy church suit with pearl earrings and soft white gloves folded carefully in one hand, because she had spent her entire life believing dignity mattered even when nobody else seemed to value it anymore. Her knees were hurting already from standing in the narrow aisle, but she refused to complain. She simply looked at the man again and said softly, "Sir, I believe you may be sitting in my seat." The man finally looked up. His expression barely changed. He glanced at her boarding pass for less than a second before giving the kind of tight smile powerful men use when they expect the world to move around them. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "there's been a mistake." And then he looked back down at his phone like the conversation was over. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman across the aisle lowered her eyes immediately. A man near the front pretended to fix his headphones even though the music had already stopped playing. The flight attendant standing 2 rows back hesitated for 1 second too long. And in that silence, something changed inside the cabin. Because everyone watching understood the same thing at the exact same moment. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't an accident. This was somebody counting on the fact that an elderly black woman would eventually get tired of arguing and quietly disappear to the back of the plane. Then came the sound that changed everything. A seatbelt unclicked. Slow, sharp, deliberate. And from seat 4A, a little girl stood up. She couldn't have been older than 9. Black dress, white blouse, hair tied neatly behind her head with a ribbon that looked freshly pressed that morning. She stepped into the aisle beside Dorothy without saying a word at first. Then she raised her arm fully toward the man in the gray suit and pointed directly at him. Every head on the plane turned. The little girl's face didn't move. Her voice didn't shake. "That's not your seat," she said. 7 words. Calm, precise, heavy enough to stop an entire cabin full of strangers cold. The businessman slowly lowered his phone. For the first time since the confrontation began, his confidence shifted. Not completely, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. "Excuse me?" he asked. The little girl didn't blink. "You heard me," she replied. Somewhere behind them, someone quietly lifted a phone and started recording. The flight attendant took one nervous step forward before stopping again. And the businessman's jaw tightened because something about this child unsettled him in a way the elderly woman never had. Maybe it was the certainty in her voice. Maybe it was the fact that children are supposed to stay quiet when adults misuse power. Or maybe it was because deep down, he realized the little girl already knew something nobody else on that plane knew yet. The man straightened in his seat and looked directly at her. "Go sit back down," he said quietly. "This doesn't concern you." But the little girl didn't move. She kept her finger pointed toward him, while the entire cabin held its breath waiting to see who would break first. The businessman glanced around the cabin expecting support. He expected the flight attendant to intervene. He expected another passenger to tell the child to mind her business. He expected the moment to swing back under his control the way moments usually did for men like him. But nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because the little girl was staring at him with the calm expression of someone who had already made up her mind before she ever stood up. And then she said something else. Something that caused the color to slowly drain from the man's face. "I saw what you did at the gate." The sentence landed like a crack across glass. Small, clean, dangerous. The businessman froze for half a second before forcing out a short laugh. "I have no idea what you're talking about." But now his voice sounded different. Tighter. Controlled too carefully. The little girl tilted her head slightly. "Yes, you do." And suddenly the atmosphere inside the aircraft changed completely. The passengers weren't just watching a rude man refusing to leave a seat anymore. Now they were watching someone who looked afraid of what a 9-year-old girl might say next. The elderly woman turned slowly toward the child beside her, confusion mixing with exhaustion in her eyes. She still didn't fully understand why this girl had stepped into a fight that belonged to nobody except strangers. But the little girl never looked away from the businessman. "You changed her seat," she said quietly. "I watched you do it." A silence spread across the first-class cabin so deep that even the low hum of the airplane engines suddenly sounded loud. The businessman opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out immediately. And in that tiny pause, every person around him understood the same terrifying possibility. The little girl might be telling the truth. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The businessman's smile faded slowly, not all at once, but carefully, like someone realizing the room around him was no longer moving in the direction he expected. Caleb Whitmore had spent most of his adult life inside spaces where confidence functioned like currency. Boardrooms, private lounges, fundraisers, meetings where speaking calmly and sounding certain was often enough to make people stop questioning him. Men like Caleb rarely had to explain themselves twice, especially not to a child. But the little girl standing in the aisle beside Dorothy Brooks wasn't reacting the way people usually reacted to him. She wasn't intimidated by his expensive watch or his measured tone or the irritation beginning to sharpen beneath his voice. She was simply watching him, quietly, completely, and for reasons nobody else on Flight 271 understood yet, that seemed to make Caleb uncomfortable. Dorothy still stood there holding her boarding pass with both hands now, her fingers tightening around the paper while she looked between the businessman and the child beside her. She had boarded the plane nearly 20 minutes earlier, believing the hardest part of the day was already behind her. She thought the long months of sacrifice had finally led to this moment. But now she stood in the aisle of a crowded aircraft while strangers watched her dignity being tested in public. And the worst part was that some of them were already beginning to look away. Because people often look away when they suspect the truth might demand something from them. Dorothy Brooks knew that feeling well. She had known it for most of her life. 72 years old. Widow. Retired hospital cleaner from Baltimore. For 31 years, she worked overnight shifts cleaning emergency rooms and patient halls while doctors and administrators walked past without learning her name. She raised 2 daughters after her husband died from heart failure at 54. She skipped vacations, delayed surgeries, repaired the same washing machine 3 different times because replacing it would mean giving up grocery money somewhere else. And 6 months earlier, after her doctor warned her that long flights in cramped seats could worsen the circulation problems in her knees, Dorothy made a decision she had never made before. She decided that for once in her life, she would spend money on herself without guilt. Her grandson Isaiah had earned a full academic scholarship to Columbia University in New York. First person in their family's history to receive one. Dorothy wanted to be there in person when he walked across that stage. So she worked extra shifts at the church food pantry, sold homemade pound cakes during community events, quietly saved every dollar she could, and eventually she bought seat 2A on Flight 271. First class, window seat. The seat she was still standing beside now, while another person occupied it like she had no right to question him. Caleb Whitmore finally stood up slightly from the leather seat, though not enough to actually leave it. "This is getting ridiculous," he said calmly, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored jacket. "I already told the flight attendant there was a seating correction at the gate." His tone stayed smooth, but there was something colder underneath now. Something harder. The little girl never moved. Aaliyah Monroe looked small standing in the aisle beside him, but there was a steadiness in her posture that kept drawing eyes back toward her. 9 years old. Hair braided neatly with white ribbons. Black dress pressed perfectly flat. A dark leather satchel hanging at her side that looked too formal for a child her age. And the entire time the confrontation unfolded, Aaliyah watched the adults around her with a level of attention that didn't feel childish at all. She noticed everything. The way the flight attendant kept hesitating before speaking. The way Caleb avoided directly showing anyone his phone screen for more than a second. The way passengers suddenly became fascinated with their tray tables whenever Dorothy tried explaining herself again. Aaliyah noticed all of it. And more importantly, She remembered all of it. Flight attendant Jessica Langford finally stepped closer into the aisle, forcing a professional smile that looked thinner each passing second. 12 years working for the airline had taught her how quickly small situations could become dangerous once public embarrassment entered the room. "Sir," she said carefully, "if we could just verify the boarding information one more time." Caleb barely looked at her. "You already verified it." Jessica hesitated, because technically he was right. 10 minutes earlier, Caleb had shown her a digital boarding pass displaying seat 2A. She remembered seeing it. But now, standing here while Aaliyah stared directly at him without fear, Jessica felt something pressing against the back of her mind. Something about the interaction at the gate earlier. Something she couldn't fully explain yet. Aaliyah spoke before Jessica could continue. "Then why won't he show it again?" Every passenger close enough to hear turned toward Caleb immediately. His jaw tightened. "Excuse me." Aaliyah shrugged slightly. "If it's really his seat, why does he keep hiding the screen?" The cabin grew quiet again. Caleb looked around slowly, realizing too late that the balance inside the room was shifting away from him. A woman across the aisle lowered her phone halfway, pretending not to record anymore, even though the camera remained pointed directly forward. A man near the window stopped typing on his laptop entirely. Jessica Langford felt her stomach tighten because the child had just asked the exact question she herself had been avoiding asking. Caleb forced out another small laugh. "This is absurd. I'm not arguing with a little girl." But Aaliyah answered immediately. "You already are." That line hit the cabin harder than anyone expected. Several passengers looked down instantly to hide their reactions. One man quietly coughed into his fist to cover a laugh that escaped before he could stop it. Caleb noticed every bit of it. And for the first time since Dorothy approached the seat, irritation finally cracked through his polished composure. "Where are your parents?" he snapped. Aaliyah didn't blink. "Close enough." The answer lingered strangely in the air. Calm, controlled, confident. Jessica Langford looked at Aaliyah more carefully now. The satchel, the posture, the way she spoke. This wasn't random bravery from a child trying to defend an elderly woman. Aaliyah sounded like someone waiting for the right moment to say something specific. And then Jessica realized something else. Aaliyah had never once sounded surprised. Not since standing up. Almost like she already knew exactly how this confrontation was going to unfold before it ever started. Caleb must have sensed it too because his eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Aaliyah's expression never changed. "You know." The businessman stared at her. The little girl stared back. And somewhere deep inside the first-class cabin, tension settled into every row like heavy smoke because people were no longer asking themselves whether something dishonest had happened. Now they were asking how far it went. Why wouldn't Caleb Whitmore leave the seat? What exactly had Aaliyah Monroe seen at the gate before boarding? Why did flight attendant Jessica Langford hesitate every time the situation forced her to choose a side? Was this really just a seating dispute? Or had everyone on Flight 271 unknowingly walked into something much bigger? Aaliyah slowly reached down and placed one hand against the leather satchel hanging beside her hip. The movement was small, but Caleb noticed it instantly. And whatever confidence he still had left weakened the moment he saw her fingers touch the clasp. Because what nobody on Flight 271 knew yet was that Aaliyah already had proof. Aaliyah's fingers rested quietly against the clasp of the leather satchel, while Caleb Whitmore watched her with the growing unease of a man realizing control was slipping away from him inch by inch. Dorothy Brooks could feel the tension spreading through the cabin now. It moved differently than before. Earlier, people looked uncomfortable because they wanted the situation to disappear. Now they looked uncomfortable because they wanted answers. And somewhere beneath the embarrassment and confusion pressing against her chest, Dorothy felt something else beginning to rise too. A feeling she had spent most of her life trying to suppress whenever people underestimated her. Anger. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. The older kind. The kind built slowly over decades of being expected to accept disrespect quietly so other people could remain comfortable. Dorothy lowered her eyes toward the boarding pass, still trembling slightly between her fingers. Seat 2A. She had stared at those two characters so many times over the last 6 months, they almost stopped feeling real. Because for most of her life, first class existed in the same category as expensive jewelry store windows or oceanfront homes. Things meant for other people. Things people like Dorothy Brooks looked at briefly before continuing on with their day. She grew up in West Baltimore in a two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where 5 people shared one bathroom, and winters meant sleeping in sweaters when the heating stopped working. Her father drove delivery trucks until his back gave out. Her mother cleaned office buildings overnight downtown. Nobody in her family had ever flown first class before. Nobody even talked about it. And yet somehow, 6 months earlier, Dorothy found herself sitting at her tiny kitchen table with a calculator, an unpaid electric bill, and a photograph of her grandson Isaiah taped beside the refrigerator while trying to figure out whether she could make the impossible happen. Isaiah Brooks was 20 years old and brilliant in the quiet way that often goes unnoticed until somebody finally pays attention long enough to recognize it. He loved engineering, built radios from spare parts as a teenager, fixed neighbors' televisions for free because he hated watching people throw things away that could still work. He studied late into the night at the same dining room table where Dorothy once helped him sound out spelling words in elementary school. And when the scholarship letter from Columbia University arrived, Isaiah cried before Dorothy did. Full academic scholarship, housing included. One of only 12 students selected nationwide for the program. Dorothy still remembered the exact way his hands shook opening the envelope. She remembered him saying, "Grandma, we did it. Not I did it. We did it." Because Isaiah understood something many successful people forget once life starts rewarding them. Nobody reaches the finish line alone. Dorothy had helped raise him while his mother worked double shifts at a nursing home. She attended every school presentation, packed every lunch, sat through every science fair. And when he got accepted into Columbia, there was never a question whether she would attend the scholarship ceremony in New York. The only question was how. 2 weeks later, Dorothy sat in a doctor's office while Dr. Leonard Harris reviewed the swelling in her knees and circulation scans from her last appointment. Long flights and cramped seating could become dangerous at your age, he explained carefully, especially with the condition worsening. Dorothy laughed softly at first, because people with limited income learn quickly how to translate medical advice into financial reality. More legroom sounded expensive. Expensive sounded impossible. But then Dr. Harris looked directly at her and said something she couldn't stop thinking about afterward. "You spent your entire life taking care of other people, Ms. Brooks. Your body's asking you to take care of yourself now." That sentence followed her home. Followed her through every overnight shift at the church pantry. Every extra weekend cleaning offices downtown for cash. Every pound cake she baked and sold during community fundraisers. Dorothy started saving money in secret because even at 72 years old, spending that much money on herself still felt selfish somehow. Every Friday night, she sat at her kitchen table counting folded bills beside a yellow notepad, while old gospel music played softly from the radio near the sink. $20, $40, sometimes $70 if the week went well. She stopped ordering takeout completely, repaired her winter coat instead of replacing it, told her daughters she was doing just fine whenever they offered help because pride becomes complicated after a certain age, especially when you spent your entire life surviving without asking for much. Then one night near the end of February, Dorothy finally opened her laptop and purchased Seat 2A on Flight 271 to New York. First class. Window seat. She stared at the confirmation screen for nearly 30 seconds after the payment processed because it felt unreal seeing her own name attached to something she had convinced herself belonged to richer people. The booking confirmation email arrived at exactly 11:42 p.m. Dorothy printed 2 copies immediately. One for her purse. One for the kitchen drawer beside her Bible and insurance papers because she trusted printed paper more than phone screens. This wasn't luxury. It was the first time in her life she decided she deserved comfort too. A week before the flight, Dorothy removed her late husband's pearl earrings from the small velvet jewelry box she kept hidden in the closet beside folded blankets and old photographs. Robert Brooks bought them during their 40th anniversary, even though they couldn't really afford them at the time. Dorothy wore them only for important moments. Weddings, funerals, church anniversaries. And now this. She pressed her blue church suit herself the night before departure, hung it carefully beside the bedroom door, slept barely 3 hours because excitement kept waking her every time she closed her eyes. By the time she arrived at the airport the next afternoon, Dorothy believed the hardest part was already over. She thought the struggle had been saving the money. working the extra shifts, convincing herself she was worthy of spending it. She thought once she stepped onto that plane, she could finally relax and simply enjoy the journey toward one of the proudest moments of her life. She had no idea the real fight would begin after she boarded the plane. Dorothy Brooks stood silently in the aisle while the pressure inside the cabin continued building around her, but Caleb Whitmore remained seated in 2A with the composure of someone who had spent years learning how to stay comfortable while other people became uncomfortable around him. That was the thing about Caleb. Nothing about him looked openly cruel. If someone walked onto the plane 10 minutes earlier and glanced briefly toward first class, they probably would have assumed he was successful, polished, educated, maybe even respectable. 43 years old. Senior investment executive for a Manhattan financial firm managing millions in private assets. Tailored charcoal suit. Silver watch. Calm voice. The kind of man who knew exactly how long to maintain eye contact during a handshake and exactly when to smile during negotiations. Men like Caleb rarely shouted because they usually didn't need to. The world had spent too many years rewarding their confidence for them to ever develop panic as a habit. He moved through life with the quiet expectation that situations would eventually bend around his preferences if he stayed firm long enough. And most of the time, they did. Earlier that afternoon, Caleb sat inside the private airport lounge sipping espresso while taking a conference call about a merger involving one of his firm's wealthiest clients. He barely acknowledged the bartender who brought his drink, barely looked at the employee cleaning the glass tables near the windows. He answered emails while discussing investment projections in the same detached tone people use ordering lunch. Calm, controlled, efficient. At 3:48 p.m., his assistant texted him reminding him there were no first-class seats available on Flight 271. Caleb read the message twice before locking his phone screen without responding, because Caleb Whitmore was not accustomed to hearing the word unavailable, especially not when money existed nearby. A few minutes later, he left the lounge and walked toward Gate 7B with the same relaxed confidence that made strangers step slightly aside without realizing they were doing it. Aaliyah Monroe noticed him almost immediately. She had been seated near the charging station across from the gate, with an aeronautical engineering book resting open across her lap, while her mother stepped away briefly to take a phone call. Aaliyah liked airports because airports revealed things about people. Some travelers became kinder when stressed. Others became louder. Some helped strangers with luggage. Others stopped seeing strangers altogether. Aaliyah watched all of it carefully, and when Caleb Whitmore approached the gate counter, something about him caught her attention immediately. Maybe it was the way he leaned forward without greeting the gate agent first. Maybe it was the tone in his voice. Not aggressive. Worse. Familiar. Comfortable. Like he expected cooperation before the conversation even started. The gate agent looked young. Early 20s at most. Her airline badge read Hannah Collins. Aaliyah watched Hannah smile nervously while Caleb spoke quietly across the counter and pointed once toward the boarding screen hanging overhead. Hannah typed something into the system while nodding uncertainly. Then Caleb removed his phone and showed her something on the screen. Aaliyah couldn't hear the entire conversation from where she sat, but she noticed details children often notice because adults assume they won't. She noticed Hannah glance twice toward another employee before continuing. She noticed Caleb never smiled once during the interaction. And she noticed something else too. After Hannah finished typing, Caleb's entire posture relaxed. Not dramatically, just enough for Aaliyah to recognize the expression adults were when they get exactly what they wanted. He thanked the gate agent softly and walked away while adjusting the cuff of his jacket. Hannah remained at the counter staring at the screen several seconds longer than necessary before quickly minimizing whatever had been open. Aaliyah kept watching. Her. The young gate agent looked uncomfortable afterward. Not frightened exactly. More like someone replaying a decision internally while trying to convince themselves it was harmless. Aaliyah glanced down at her own tablet for a moment, then quietly lifted it toward the gate counter and took a photograph through the terminal glass. One quick picture. Nothing obvious. Then she lowered the tablet again and returned to her book before anyone noticed. 20 minutes later, boarding began. And now here they were. Caleb Whitmore sitting comfortably in seat 2A while Dorothy Brooks stood beside him holding a boarding pass she paid for with 6 months of sacrifice. The first-class cabin still felt suspended in tension. like the entire aircraft had paused midair waiting for someone to force the truth into the open. Jessica Langford looked between Aaliyah and Caleb carefully now. Her training told her to de-escalate the situation quickly. Her instincts told her something was deeply wrong. Caleb finally leaned back against the leather seat again and folded his hands calmly across his lap, but the movement felt more deliberate this time, more controlled. "This has gotten completely out of hand," he said quietly. "I showed my boarding credentials already. I'm not sure why everyone's entertaining accusations from a child." Aaliyah answered immediately, "Because children usually tell the truth." A few passengers exchanged quick looks. Caleb noticed that too. His eyes shifted briefly toward the phones now pointed openly in his direction. Public attention changes people, even confident people, especially men who built their lives carefully protecting how others perceive them. Caleb could feel the atmosphere changing around him now. He was losing authority inside the room, and that irritated him more than the accusation itself. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice tightening slightly for the first time. "You have no idea what you think you saw?" Aaliyah tilted her head just slightly. "I know enough." Jessica Langford felt her stomach sink hearing that response because Aaliyah still sounded too certain, too prepared. Like this confrontation had started long before Dorothy Brooks ever stepped onto the aircraft. Caleb stared directly at the little girl now, and for one brief moment, the polished executive mask slipped just enough for something sharper underneath to appear. Not rage. Calculation. He was trying to figure out exactly how much she knew. And 42 minutes before boarding, Aaliyah saw him do something she would never forget. 42 minutes before boarding, Aaliyah Monroe watched Caleb Whitmore walk away from the gate counter with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the problem had already been solved. At the time, she didn't fully understand what she had witnessed. She only understood the feeling it left behind. Adults often ignored feelings like that because experience teaches people how to silence their instincts in order to keep life moving smoothly. But Aaliyah was 9 years old, and children sometimes notice danger precisely because they haven't yet learned how to explain it away. So she remembered everything. The young gate agent named Hannah Collins nervously adjusting her lanyard after Caleb left the counter. The quick glance over her shoulder before minimizing the screen. The strange look on her face afterward, somewhere between confusion and regret. Aaliyah remembered all of it while boarding flight 271 beside her mother 20 minutes later. And then she saw Dorothy Brooks stop beside seat 2A. That was the moment everything began. Dorothy smiled politely at first because politeness had become instinctive over the course of her life. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, lifting the printed boarding pass slightly. "I believe this may be my seat." Caleb Whitmore barely looked up from his phone. "No," he answered calmly. There was a reassignment at the gate. The words came easily, smoothly, like he'd already rehearsed them in his mind before she arrived. Dorothy blinked once. "I'm sorry." Caleb sighed quietly through his nose, finally glancing toward the paper in her hand before returning his attention to the screen in front of him. "They changed the seating arrangement before boarding," he explained. "You should probably speak with the flight attendant. Not rude, not openly hostile," which somehow made the interaction feel worse. Because men like Caleb understood something important about public perception. If you stay calm while someone else grows emotional, people often assume you must be the reasonable one. Dorothy looked down at her boarding pass again. Seat 2A. Same number. Same confirmation. Same seat she printed twice at her kitchen table 6 months earlier. For a second, she simply stood there trying to process the disconnect between what she knew and what she was being told. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably while pretending not to listen. A businessman across the aisle suddenly became fascinated with his laptop screen. A woman near the front adjusted her purse twice, even though it was already sitting perfectly beside her. Human beings have a remarkable ability to sense when something unfair is happening directly in front of them. They also have an equally remarkable ability to convince themselves it's somebody else's responsibility to intervene. Dorothy swallowed gently and tried again. Softer this time. "Sir, I booked this seat several months ago." Caleb finally looked at her fully then. Calm expression, patient tone. The exact voice someone uses when explaining something obvious to a confused stranger. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm sure the airline will sort it out for you. For you, not with you." The distinction mattered. Jessica Langford arrived moments later after noticing the delay near the front cabin. "Is there a problem here?" she asked professionally, though something in her expression already suggested she sensed the answer. Dorothy turned immediately toward her with visible relief. "I think there may have been some kind of mistake," she explained gently. "This boarding pass says 2A, but—" Jessica accepted the paper and examined it carefully. Her eyes flicked toward Caleb, who calmly lifted his phone screen toward her. "Like I explained," he said, "the gate reassigned the seating before boarding." Jessica looked at the phone briefly. Too briefly. Then back toward Dorothy. "One moment," she said quietly. But hesitation had already entered her voice. And Dorothy noticed it immediately. Older people notice hesitation because they've lived long enough to recognize when someone is deciding whether helping you is worth the inconvenience. Jessica checked the boarding pass again. Then Caleb's screen. Then the small device in her hand connected to the flight manifest. Something about the situation clearly wasn't settling correctly in her mind, but uncertainty inside crowded public spaces often creates paralysis, especially when one person sounds confident and the other sounds apologetic for causing trouble. Dorothy shifted her weight carefully as pain spread through her knees from standing in the narrow aisle. Still, she smiled politely. "I don't mind waiting," she said softly. I know this is the seat I paid for." The sentence landed quietly. Too quietly. Because there was something deeply painful about hearing a 72-year-old woman explain herself so gently while holding proof in her hands. It sounded practiced. Familiar. Like she'd spent years learning how to ask for fairness without sounding demanding. Jessica hesitated again. Caleb remained seated. And around them, nobody moved. The silence inside the cabin became unbearable because every second that passed without correction slowly transformed the situation from confusion into humiliation. Dorothy looked down once more at the boarding pass, trembling slightly between her fingers. Then she did something that changed the emotional temperature of the entire aircraft. She softened her voice even further. "Please," she said quietly. "My knees aren't very good. I really would appreciate sitting down." That was the moment many passengers stopped pretending this was simply an airline mix-up, because there was something devastating about the way she said it. No anger, no entitlement, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone accustomed to making herself smaller so other people wouldn't become uncomfortable around her needs. A man 2 rows back slowly removed his headphones. A woman near the window pressed her lips together while staring at the floor. Jessica Langford opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could say anything, another sound cut through the cabin. Click. A seatbelt unfastening. Aaliyah Monroe stood slowly from seat 4A. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled. Her small leather satchel rested against her side as she stepped into the aisle beside Dorothy Brooks. Caleb looked at her immediately, irritation flashing across his face before disappearing again beneath forced composure. Aaliyah stared directly at him. Then she raised her arm and pointed one finger toward seat 2A. The cabin froze. Nobody shifted. Nobody whispered. Even the movement of passengers placing luggage overhead seemed to stop all at once. Aaliyah's face remained perfectly calm. "That's her seat," she said. Caleb exhaled sharply through his nose. "Young lady," he replied carefully, "this doesn't concern you." Aaliyah never lowered her arm. "It does now." Jessica Langford looked between them anxiously while several passengers openly reached for their phones. The tension inside first class no longer felt private anymore. It felt public, permanent. Like everyone suddenly understood they were witnessing a moment people would talk about long after the plane landed. Caleb straightened slightly in his seat. "Go sit down," he said. Aaliyah's eyes never left his. No, the businessman's jaw tightened. Dorothy stared at the little girl beside her in complete confusion now, unable to understand why this child was willing to challenge a grown man in a room full of adults who refused to do the same. But Aaliyah didn't look afraid. If anything, she looked certain. Certain in a way that made Caleb visibly uneasy. And then the little girl said something that changed the entire flight. The first thing people remembered later was not the argument itself. It was the silence after Aaliyah Monroe spoke. A strange silence. Heavy enough that even the faint hum of the aircraft ventilation suddenly sounded sharp inside the cabin. The little girl kept her arm extended toward Caleb Whitmore, while every passenger around them waited for somebody to break the moment apart and return things to normal. But nothing about Flight 271 felt normal anymore. Aaliyah's face remained calm. No anger. No trembling. No dramatic performance. That was what unsettled Caleb most. Children usually raised their voices when they challenged adults. They got emotional, defensive, frightened once pressure pushed back against them. Aaliyah did none of those things. She simply looked at him with the steady composure of someone who already understood exactly where the conversation was heading. Caleb forced a tight smile that failed to fully hide the irritation spreading across his face now. "I'm going to ask you one last time to return to your seat," he said quietly. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "Do you even know whose seat you're sitting in?" The question landed harder than anyone expected because of how she said it. Calm, controlled, almost thoughtful, not accusing him, examining him. Caleb's expression shifted for half a second before he caught himself again. "I know exactly where I'm sitting," he answered. Aaliyah nodded slowly. "That's the problem." A woman near row 3 openly lifted her phone higher now, no longer pretending she wasn't recording. Two men farther back removed their earbuds completely and leaned slightly into the aisle. The social pressure inside first class was beginning to change direction. Earlier, passengers avoided eye contact because confronting unfairness felt uncomfortable. Now they were staring directly at Caleb Whitmore because something about Aaliyah's certainty made people suspect there was far more happening here than a simple seat dispute. Jessica Langford felt it too. Her stomach tightened every time Aaliyah spoke because the child sounded less like someone defending an elderly stranger and more like someone presenting evidence. Caleb crossed his arms slowly. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice remaining calm through visible effort. "Jessica, I expect this situation handled immediately." Jessica hesitated. That hesitation lasted barely 2 seconds, but everyone nearby noticed it. Caleb noticed it most of all, because for the first time since Dorothy Brooks approached seat 2A, the authority inside the cabin was no longer automatically aligning with him. Aaliyah finally lowered her arm, but stayed standing beside Dorothy. "You told the gate agent there was a seating reassignment," she said quietly. Caleb looked directly at her now. "Because there was." Aaliyah shook her head once. "No, there wasn't." Another silence spread across the cabin. Jessica Langford swallowed carefully. "Aaliyah," she began cautiously, "what exactly are you saying?" Aaliyah answered without looking away from Caleb. "I'm saying he changed her seat himself." Several passengers reacted instantly. One man muttered, "Oh, wow," beneath his breath. A woman near the aisle covered her mouth briefly while still recording. Caleb laughed once, but the sound came out tighter than intended. "That's ridiculous." Aaliyah remained perfectly composed. "Is it?" Caleb leaned forward slightly in the seat now, irritation breaking more visibly through his polished exterior. "You are a child," he said firmly. "You have absolutely no idea how airline systems work." Aaliyah nodded again. "Maybe not." Then she paused just long enough for the tension to settle deeper into the room before continuing. "But I know what I saw." The businessman's jaw flexed. Jessica Langford suddenly became aware of how quiet the cabin had grown around them. Even passengers boarding farther back were beginning to notice something serious was unfolding in first class. A gate agent stepped briefly through the boarding door near the front, glanced toward the growing crowd of attention, then disappeared again. Aaliyah finally turned slightly toward Dorothy Brooks for the first time since standing up. Her voice softened just enough to reveal the child beneath all the composure. "You shouldn't have to keep proving yourself," she said gently. Dorothy stared at her, visibly overwhelmed now. Nobody had spoken to her like that since the confrontation began. Everybody else kept asking for verification, clarification, patience. Aaliyah was the first person who spoke as though Dorothy's dignity mattered more than procedure. Caleb shifted in seat 2A again. "Jessica," he said sharply this time, "either resolve this or I'll be contacting corporate before we even leave the ground." That sentence changed something inside Jessica Langford immediately, because now she recognized the tactic. Pressure the employee, escalate authority, make hesitation feel dangerous. She had seen passengers do it before. But suddenly, with Aaliyah watching quietly from beside Dorothy Brooks, the entire interaction looked different than it had 10 minutes earlier. Jessica extended her hand carefully toward Caleb. "Sir, I'm going to need to see the boarding pass again." Caleb didn't move immediately. That delay lasted only a second. But once again, Aaliyah noticed it. Everyone did. Slowly, Caleb unlocked his phone and held the screen outward. Jessica stepped closer this time, instead of glancing quickly from a distance. And the closer she looked, the more uncertainty crept across her expression. Aaliyah watched her carefully. "Look at the timestamp," she said quietly. Jessica's eyes flicked downward. Caleb immediately pulled the phone back. "This is absurd," he snapped. "I'm not standing here while a child invents accusations." Aaliyah's expression never changed. "Then why won't you let her finish checking?" Caleb stood up abruptly from seat 2A now, forcing several nearby passengers backwards slightly in the narrow aisle. He was still composed, but barely. "Because I don't answer to children." Aaliyah looked up at him calmly. "You might today." The line hit the cabin like a shockwave. A man near the front actually lowered his newspaper completely now. Someone whispered, "Jesus," beneath their breath. Jessica Langford looked between them anxiously because she could feel the situation moving beyond her control entirely. On the overhead monitor near the front of the cabin, a departure update flashed briefly. Departure in 11 minutes. The countdown suddenly changed everything. Because now there was pressure. Time. Stakes. Caleb saw it too. He glanced once toward the boarding door before turning back toward Aaliyah with a colder expression than before. "Enough," he said quietly. "Whatever little game you think you're playing, it ends right now." Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment. Then she slowly reached down toward the leather satchel hanging beside her hip. Caleb's face changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for Jessica Langford to notice. Enough for the passengers recording to lean forward slightly. Enough for Dorothy Brooks to realize the little girl beside her had known something important from the very beginning. Aaliyah carefully opened the clasp on the bag. Then Aaliyah reached into her bag. Aaliyah Monroe reached into the leather satchel slowly enough that every person watching her seemed to stop breathing at the same time. Caleb Whitmore stood motionless beside seat 2A now, his eyes fixed on the bag with a level of focus he had carefully avoided showing until this moment. Jessica Langford noticed it immediately. So did the passengers recording from nearby rows. Because people only react that way when they're afraid of what somebody might pull out next. Aaliyah's small fingers disappeared briefly inside the satchel before emerging with a folded stack of papers clipped neatly together at the corner. She held them carefully in both hands, smoothing the edges once against her dress before looking up at Jessica. "You should probably see these first," she said calmly. Jessica hesitated only a second before accepting the papers. The flight attendant's hands looked steady outwardly, but her pulse had begun beating hard enough she could feel it in her wrists. Aaliyah pointed quietly toward the first page. "That one first." Jessica unfolded the top document slowly. It was a printed booking confirmation. Passenger name, Dorothy Brooks. Flight 271. Los Angeles to New York. Seat assignment, 2A. First class. Payment status, confirmed. Jessica's eyes scanned lower toward the timestamp near the bottom corner. Purchased 6 months earlier. Paid in full. Caleb spoke immediately. Anybody can print something off a computer. But his voice sounded different now. Less polished. Less relaxed. Aaliyah ignored him completely. "Look at the second page," she told Jessica softly. Jessica turned the paper over. This document looked different. Internal formatting. Airline coding references. System transaction logs. Jessica frowned slightly while reading the header because ordinary passengers were never supposed to have access to those records. Her eyes moved lower. Booking ID matched Dorothy Brooks's reservation. Seat reassignment processed at Gate 7B. Timestamp. 4:02 p.m. 42 minutes before boarding. Jessica's stomach tightened. Caleb folded his arms harder across his chest. "This proves nothing." Aaliyah finally looked at him again. "You're right," she said quietly. "Not by itself." Then she pointed toward the third page. Jessica turned it carefully. The moment she saw the photograph, her expression changed completely. It was grainy but clear enough. A picture taken through the terminal glass facing Gate 7B. The airline system screen was visible in the background with an active seating modification open. And standing beside the counter, partially reflected in the monitor itself, was Caleb Whitmore leaning toward the gate agent while she typed into the system. Jessica looked up immediately. Caleb's jaw tightened visibly now. "That picture doesn't prove I changed anything," he snapped. Aaliyah stayed calm. "No," she agreed. "It proves you were standing there while the seat got changed." Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. The woman recording near row 3 actually whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Jessica flipped back toward the system log again, comparing the timestamp against the photograph. Same minute, same gate, same reservation number connected to Dorothy Brooks. Suddenly, the entire sequence inside her mind began rearranging itself into something ugly and unmistakable. She remembered Caleb showing his phone quickly without allowing her to fully inspect it. She remembered his impatience whenever verification took longer than expected. She remembered the confidence, the pressure, the assumption that she would simply accept his explanation and move on. And worst of all, Jessica realized something else. Dorothy Brooks had been telling the truth the entire time while she stood there silently questioning her anyway. The realization hit hard enough Jessica physically lowered the papers for a second. Dorothy noticed it immediately. "Miss?" she asked softly. Jessica looked toward her, and for the first time since the confrontation started, guilt crossed clearly over the flight attendant's face. Not professional concern. Guilt. Because Jessica Langford suddenly understood she had spent the last 20 minutes asking a 72-year-old woman to repeatedly defend her right to sit in a seat she had lawfully purchased while giving the benefit of the doubt to the man who manipulated the system against her. Older passengers recognized that look instantly because many of them had seen it before in hospitals, banks, offices, classrooms. The moment somebody realizes too late, they trusted confidence more than truth. Caleb noticed the emotional shift happening inside the cabin too. And for the first time since boarding, actual cracks began appearing beneath his composure. His jaw clenched harder. His breathing shortened slightly. His responses came quicker now, sharper around the edges. "Jessica," he said firmly, "I strongly suggest you stop entertaining this nonsense before it becomes a legal issue for the airline." Aaliyah answered before Jessica could speak. "It already is." Caleb's eyes snapped toward her immediately. The little girl still looked calm. That calmness was beginning to disturb him more than the papers themselves. Because people bluff differently when they're afraid. Aaliyah never sounded afraid. Jessica looked back down at the documents again. "Where did you get internal transaction records?" she asked quietly. Aaliyah answered without hesitation. "My mother requested them." Caleb laughed once, but the sound lacked confidence now. "Requested them from who exactly?" Aaliyah paused for just a moment before replying. "People who care whether passengers are being manipulated." The businessman's face hardened. "This is insane." But nobody in first class looked convinced anymore. Not after the photograph. Not after the timestamps. Not after watching Caleb grow more irritated every time Aaliyah calmly introduced another piece of evidence. The passengers had started this situation uncertain who to believe. Now they were watching a polished executive slowly lose control under pressure from a 9-year-old girl who never once raised her voice. Jessica Langford finally lowered the documents completely. "Sir," she began carefully, "I'm going to need you to step out of the seat while we sort this out properly." Caleb stared at her in disbelief. "Excuse me." Jessica swallowed once. "Please." The word barely left her mouth before Caleb's expression darkened noticeably. "Do you understand who you're accusing right now?" Jessica hesitated again. Aaliyah noticed that too. "She's not accusing you," Aaliyah said quietly. "The documents are." Caleb looked directly at Aaliyah now with open hostility beginning to replace his carefully maintained calm. "You think you're very smart, don't you?" Aaliyah shrugged slightly. "Smart enough to take a picture." Another silence spread through the cabin. The businessman's breathing slowed again, but only because he was forcing it to. He understood something dangerous now. The situation was no longer about removing Dorothy Brooks from seat 2A quietly before departure. The situation had become public, recorded, witnessed, and somewhere behind his eyes, calculations were changing rapidly. He was no longer asking himself whether he could control the room. He was trying to determine how much Aaliyah Monroe truly knew. Jessica looked back down at the pages again, but this time her attention caught something she hadn't fully processed before. A small notation near the bottom corner of the reassignment log. Additional supporting materials attached. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Aaliyah," she asked slowly, "what does this mean?" Aaliyah looked at her calmly. Then she reached into the satchel again. Caleb's face lost color almost immediately. And in that moment, Jessica Langford realized something terrifying. The documents weren't the worst part. Aaliyah Monroe's hand moved back into the leather satchel, but this time she did not immediately pull anything out. She paused there, fingers resting on something inside. as if deciding exactly how much truth the cabin was ready to handle next. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. Jessica Langford noticed it first. Because flight attendants are trained to recognize when a situation shifts from confusion to something far more serious. Caleb Whitmore noticed it too, but in a different way. His posture changed slightly. Not visibly panicked. Not yet. But controlled irritation was no longer enough to mask the growing discomfort in his expression. Aaliyah finally withdrew another document. This one was thinner. A printed statement with airline letterhead at the top. She handed it directly to Jessica without hesitation. Jessica unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the first line. It was an internal incident summary. Gate 7B. Terminal modification event. Subject, seat reassignment authorization. Jessica's eyes moved lower. And then she stopped, because a name appeared in the report that had not been mentioned out loud yet. Gate agent, Hannah Collins. New hire. Probationary status. Jessica looked up immediately toward the rear of the cabin. Hannah Collins was seated in economy class, 3 rows from the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, head slightly lowered, as if she had been hoping not to be noticed at all. Jessica's voice lowered instinctively. Hannah, she called gently. The young gate agent flinched slightly before slowly standing up. Every passenger in first class turned to look. Hannah walked forward slowly, stopping near the front galley area. Her eyes never met Caleb's directly. She started, then stopped. Her voice shook slightly. Aaliyah watched her calmly. It's okay, Aaliyah said softly. That was all it took for Hannah's composure to begin breaking. He told me it was approved, she said quickly now, looking toward Jessica instead of Caleb. He said the passenger agreed to a voluntary downgrade, and that it was urgent, and that I just needed to process it before boarding closed. Jessica's eyes sharpened slightly. Did you verify the passenger consent? Hannah hesitated. That hesitation lasted just long enough for everyone to understand the answer. No, she admitted quietly. A small sound moved through the cabin. Not loud, but unmistakable. The sound of people realizing this was no longer a misunderstanding. Caleb exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous, he said immediately. She's a new employee. She clearly misunderstood standard procedure. But his voice had changed again. Less authority now. More correction. More control attempt. Aaliyah turned slightly toward him. She didn't misunderstand, she said quietly. She was told what to do. Caleb stared at her. By who? Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the satchel again and placed a final document on the counter. Jessica picked it up first this time without prompting. The header read, Aviation Compliance Review Unit. Her eyes scanned downward. Investigator name, Dr. Amara Monroe. Jessica looked up sharply. Your mother? Aaliyah nodded. She works with airline compliance systems, she said calmly. She reviews patterns like this. Caleb let out a short laugh again, but it sounded thinner now. So let me get this straight, he said. You're telling me a child and her mother orchestrated an investigation just because of a seating dispute? Aaliyah looked at him directly. No, she replied. This isn't the first time. That sentence changed the temperature of the entire cabin. Jessica froze slightly. Hannah lowered her head even further. Caleb's expression tightened. Aaliyah continued. There were 3 similar incidents flagged over the past year. Same pattern. Seat reassigned after boarding started. Same explanation given to gate staff. Same type of passenger displaced. Jessica turned another page quickly, scanning the attached notes. Her breathing slowed. Because Aaliyah was right. There were records. Not vague accusations. Documented cases. Flight numbers. Dates. Terminal logs. Internal compliance notes marked unresolved. Caleb stepped forward now, voice sharper. This is a coordinated attempt to defame me, he said firmly. I don't know what you think you have, but none of this is admissible. Aaliyah looked at him calmly again. You're right, she said. Caleb blinked slightly. That wasn't the response he expected. Aaliyah continued. It's not about admissibility. She paused. It's about pattern recognition. Jessica flipped another page, and her expression changed again. Because now she was seeing escalation notes from internal compliance reviewers asking why the incidents kept involving the same type of passenger displacement under executive accommodation requests. A phrase that appeared again and again across multiple reports. Caleb Whitmore shifted slightly in seat 2A. The first real sign of unease. This is getting out of hand, he said more quietly now. Aaliyah closed the satchel gently. It already did, she replied. Hannah finally spoke again, barely audible. I didn't want to do it, she said. I thought I would lose my job if I questioned it. Jessica looked at her for a long moment, then back at Caleb, then down at the reports again. Something inside her shifted completely now, because she realized this wasn't just about one seat anymore. This was about pressure, authority, systems that allowed fear to replace verification, and people like Hannah being caught in between. Caleb looked around the cabin now, noticing the change in atmosphere. Passengers were no longer uncertain. They were watching him differently, not confused anymore, evaluating. Aaliyah stepped slightly closer to Jessica. You asked what I saw at the gate, she said quietly. Jessica nodded slowly. Aaliyah continued. I saw him tell her what to write. Caleb's jaw tightened sharply. That is not what happened. Aaliyah didn't raise her voice. Then explain why your name appears in every system modification log tied to those cases. Silence. Jessica looked down again. Confirmed entries. Authorization trails. Override markers. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time, no confident explanation followed, and that silence was louder than anything else in the cabin. Aaliyah finally looked up toward the front of the aircraft. He's not just sitting in the wrong seat, she said quietly. He's been changing them. Jessica's eyes widened slightly as everything connected at once. Hannah stepped back slowly, as if finally understanding the scale of what she had been pulled into. Caleb remained standing now, but something in his composure had begun to fracture in ways he could no longer fully conceal. And then, from the front of the aircraft, the cabin door opened, and the captain entered the cabin. The moment the captain stepped into the cabin, everything changed without anyone needing to speak. Captain Michael Reeves did not rush. He never rushed. Even in situations like this, especially in situations like this, his presence carried a kind of controlled weight that immediately pulled attention away from arguments and toward procedure. His eyes moved across the front of the aircraft slowly. Jessica Langford holding a stack of documents. Hannah Collins standing near the galley with her head lowered. Dorothy Brooks seated in 2A, still visibly shaken but finally no longer standing. Caleb Whitmore positioned beside her space, no longer fully seated, no longer fully in control of the situation either. And Aaliyah Monroe, small, still, watching everything with the same quiet precision she had maintained since this began. The captain extended his hand. I'll take everything, he said calmly. Jessica hesitated only a second before placing the documents into his hands. He did not skim. He read every page, slowly, methodically, the kind of reading that forces everyone else in the room to wait inside their own thoughts. No one spoke. Even Caleb remained silent now, watching the captain's eyes move line by line through the system logs, the boarding confirmation, the reassignment timestamp, and the photograph. The longer the captain read, the quieter the cabin became. Passengers who had been recording lowered their phones slightly without realizing it. People who had been whispering stopped completely. The air inside the aircraft felt tighter, as if the entire cabin was waiting for a single sentence to determine what came next. Captain Reeves reached the final page and paused. That pause lasted longer than expected. Then he exhaled once, closed the documents, and looked directly at Caleb Whitmore. Sir, he said evenly, your assigned seat is 27F. There was no emotion in the delivery, no emphasis, just fact. But the effect was immediate. For half a second, the cabin did not react. It processed, because everyone had heard it. But everyone needed a moment to understand it. 27F, economy, rear cabin. The realization spread slowly through first class like a wave that didn't need sound to be felt. A man who had spent the entire confrontation seated in a seat that did not belong to him. A man who had corrected others, dismissed staff, pressured a gate agent, and challenged a child. Now officially identified as occupying the wrong seat from the beginning. Jessica Langford lowered her gaze slightly, not in shame exactly, but in the uncomfortable recognition of what had just been confirmed. Hannah Collins covered her mouth with one hand, her breathing unsteady now as the full weight of her decision settled in. She had changed a seat assignment based on a lie. Caleb Whitmore finally sat down again, but this time the movement looked different, less like confidence returning, more like pressure forcing him back into position. Captain Reeves turned slightly toward Hannah next. Miss Collins, he said quietly. She looked up immediately, eyes filled with fear and exhaustion now. Yes, sir. Explain your action. Her voice broke slightly before she even began. He told me it was authorized, she said quickly. He said it was a corporate downgrade request and that the passenger had agreed, and I didn't verify it properly. I should have verified it. Her words came faster now, like someone trying to return to safety by fully exposing what they had done wrong. I didn't want to cause problems on my first week, she added, voice shaking. I thought I was just following procedure. Captain Reeves listened without interruption. When she finished, he simply nodded once. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, just understanding of what had happened. The cabin remained completely silent. Then Jessica Langford spoke softly. Captain, the boarding pass was altered before boarding. Captain Reeves looked back down at the documents briefly, then at Caleb again. Yes, he confirmed. It was. Caleb finally spoke, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. This is being misrepresented, he said. I did not alter anything illegally. I simply clarified an available seating adjustment through the gate system. Aaliyah's eyes shifted slightly toward him. That's not what the logs say, she said quietly. The captain raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, just to maintain order. Then he turned a page in the report again, slower this time, as if confirming something he already suspected before he arrived. When he spoke again, his tone did not change. Mr. Whitmore, he said, your access to request modifications of this nature is restricted under standard passenger policy. Caleb didn't respond immediately. That silence lasted longer this time. Longer than any previous pause he had taken in this entire exchange. And in that silence, something irreversible shifted in how every passenger saw him. Not as powerful, not as confident, but as someone whose authority had only ever existed as long as it went unchallenged. The captain closed the documents fully now and placed them on the counter. This will be reviewed formally upon landing, he said. Jessica nodded immediately. Hannah lowered her head again, tears now visible but controlled. And then, quietly, she added something no one expected. I'm sorry, she said again, this time looking directly at Dorothy Brooks. Dorothy didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded once. Slowly, not in anger, not in triumph, just acknowledgement. Of everything that had happened, of everything it cost to get here. Captain Reeves turned slightly toward Aaliyah for the first time. You did the right thing bringing this forward, he said simply. Aaliyah nodded once. Yes, sir. Caleb shifted slightly in his seat again, but the movement lacked direction now. He was no longer controlling the room. The room had already moved past him. Jessica looked down at the documents one more time, then exhaled quietly, as if realizing how narrowly this had all unfolded without being dismissed entirely. The passengers remained silent, still absorbing what they had just witnessed. Because it wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about how easily truth could have been ignored if one child had not refused to sit down. Aaliyah reached into her satchel again. Captain Reeves noticed immediately. So did Caleb. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Caleb Whitmore looked genuinely uncertain. Because he understood something was still missing, something that had not yet been revealed. Aaliyah placed one final document on the counter and looked up. But I still haven't shown you everything, she said quietly. And that was when the entire cabin realized she still had one more document. Aaliyah Monroe placed the final document on the counter with both hands, carefully, as if the weight of it mattered more than the paper itself. The cabin did not move. Nobody spoke. Even breathing seemed quieter now, as though everyone understood that whatever came next would not be reversible. Captain Michael Reeves looked down at the document first, then Jessica Langford, then, almost unwillingly, Caleb Whitmore. Aaliyah did not explain it. She did not need to. The structure of authority inside the cabin had already shifted, and now it was only a question of what would be confirmed, not what would be believed. The captain opened it slowly. This document was different from the others. More formal, more complete. Internal compliance header. Legal oversight markings. Multiple signatories. Aaliyah watched his eyes move as he read. First line. Second line. Then pause. Jessica leaned slightly closer, reading along over his shoulder now without realizing it. Her expression tightened, because this was not just a continuation of the incident anymore. This was a record of pattern. A compiled investigation spanning months. Multiple flagged incidents. Seat reassignment irregularities. Gate override behaviors tied to executive-level influence requests. and attached correspondence confirming that Dr. Amara Monroe had been working in coordination with airline compliance oversight teams to identify systemic abuse of seat allocation protocols across multiple flights. Captain Reeves turned a page. Another incident. Same pattern. Different passengers. Same method of manipulation. Jessica's hand covered her mouth slightly as she read a line confirming unresolved internal warnings that had been escalated but never fully acted on. Aaliyah's mother had not been reacting to this moment. She had been preparing for it. Caleb Whitmore shifted slightly in seat 2A. For the first time since boarding, there was no controlled expression left to maintain. Just calculation. Rapid. Quiet. Because now he understood what this really was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a single seat dispute. A documented pattern being tied together in real time inside the cabin of Flight 271. Captain Reeves closed the document slowly. When he spoke, his voice was lower now. Heavier. This extends beyond this flight, he said. Jessica nodded once, unable to fully speak yet. Aaliyah finally broke her silence. My mother started reviewing cases like this after a complaint pattern was flagged 6 months ago, she said calmly. She noticed passengers being displaced from confirmed seating assignments under unauthorized executive requests. A pause. This flight wasn't random. Caleb's head lifted slightly at that. Aaliyah continued. It was part of the evidence. The words landed differently than everything before them. Because now Caleb understood something he had refused to accept until this moment. He was not just defending himself anymore. He was inside a system being examined from above, and every explanation he had used was now being stored, compared, and recorded against other cases he had never considered would connect to him. For the first time in his adult life, confidence stopped working. Not slowly. Not partially. Completely. Captain Reeves turned toward Dorothy Brooks. The elderly woman who had been standing in the aisle for what felt like an entire lifetime finally looked up. The captain gestured gently towards seat 2A. Ma'am, he said softly, you are cleared to remain in your assigned seat. Dorothy hesitated, not because she doubted the truth anymore, but because her body still remembered what it felt like to be told she didn't belong there. She slowly lowered herself into the seat again, carefully, almost like she was afraid the moment might still be taken back from her. When she finally sat down fully, something changed in her expression. Not dramatic, not visible to everyone at once, but real. A release that came after holding herself upright against uncertainty for far too long. Jessica looked at her and lowered her head slightly, as if acknowledging what had been taken from her in the process of getting here. Aaliyah watched quietly from the aisle. Caleb remained still, no longer speaking, no longer correcting, no longer explaining, just present in the full consequence of everything that had unfolded around him. Captain Reeves stepped back slightly, giving space to the moment rather than interrupting it. And then something unexpected happened. A passenger near row 4 began clapping. Slowly at first. Not loud. Not performative. Just one person acknowledging what they had witnessed. Then another joined. Then another. The sound spread through the cabin in uneven waves. Not the kind of applause that celebrates victory. This was different. Heavier. Emotional. Full of something closer to recognition than celebration. Because everyone in that cabin understood what they had just watched. A system of pressure. A moment of silence. A child refusing to accept dismissal as final. And an elderly woman who almost lost her seat not because she was wrong, but because she was easier to move than to defend. Dorothy did not look around. She simply kept her hands folded in her lap, breathing slowly, as if trying to absorb the fact that she was finally allowed to stay where she had always belonged. Aaliyah sat down quietly in seat 4A again, her hands resting now, no longer shaking. Jessica remained standing near the front, still holding part of the documents, but her expression had softened into something quieter, something reflective, even regretful. Caleb finally exhaled, long and controlled, but there was no recovery left in it. The structure he relied on had already collapsed around him. The cabin slowly returned to stillness, but it was not the same stillness as before. This one carried memory, awareness, and the uncomfortable understanding that nothing about what had just happened would leave the people on this flight unchanged. Because sometimes justice does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through a child who refuses to sit down. The aircraft had been in the air for several minutes now, cruising steadily above the clouds as Flight 271 continued its journey toward New York. The cabin, once tense and fractured, had settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the uneasy silence of uncertainty, but the reflective stillness that follows something no one fully expected to witness. Dorothy Brooks sat in seat 2A with her shoulders finally lowered. Her hands rested gently in her lap now, no longer trembling the way they had been earlier. For the first time since boarding, she was not explaining herself, not defending her right to exist in a space she had already paid for. She simply sat, breathing slowly, present. Aaliyah Monroe sat in seat 4A, her small leather satchel beside her, staring out the oval window. The clouds outside moved softly beneath them, endless and quiet. But inside her body, something had not fully settled yet. Her hand still carried a faint tremor. Not fear, not regret, just the aftermath of holding too much tension for too long. Dorothy noticed it. She turned slightly in her seat, watching the 9-year-old girl who had changed everything without ever raising her voice. "Aaliyah," she said gently. Aaliyah looked over. Dorothy studied her for a moment, then reached across the armrest slowly, placing a warm, steady hand over Aaliyah's smaller one. "I know you're okay, baby," Dorothy said softly. A pause. "I just wanted you to know I see it." Aaliyah didn't respond immediately. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded once. Small, honest. And in that moment, she looked exactly like what she was. A child who had done something far beyond what children are usually asked to carry. At the front of the cabin, Jessica Langford stood quietly, no longer in crisis mode, but no longer fully at ease either. She kept glancing toward the documents that had been collected, now partially sealed, and awaiting formal review. Captain Michael Reeves had returned to the cockpit, leaving behind an atmosphere that no longer felt like conflict, but consequence. And somewhere further back in the aircraft, Caleb Whitmore remained seated in 27F, no longer part of the space he had occupied only hours earlier in first class. Not speaking, not engaging, simply present in the quiet understanding that everything around him had shifted without his permission. Dorothy leaned back slightly in her seat, her eyes closing for a brief moment, as if allowing her body to finally accept what it had been denied for so long. Aaliyah turned her gaze back out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, soft and uninterrupted, like the world had no memory of what had just happened inside the cabin above them. And then the narration settles over everything quietly. Most people on Flight 271 will remember the confrontation. A pause. The raised voices that never fully came. The documents. The silence. The moment a child stood up and refused to accept what everyone else was quietly allowing. But Dorothy Brooks will remember something else. The moment she finally sat down. The moment she was no longer asked to prove she belonged. And the moment one little girl decided her dignity mattered enough to defend it in front of everyone who refused to speak first. Aaliyah remained looking out the window, her reflection faint against the glass, small and steady as the sky moved past them. And the final thought lingers, quiet but unavoidable. If Aaliyah had stayed silent, what do you think would have happened? Because on most flights, no one stands up. No one interrupts. No one challenges what feels easier to ignore. And that is exactly why this story mattered. And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened on the flight where nobody stood up.